Hello everybody, welcome to another episode, of Brainstorm, which is a video series that's barely gotten off the ground. I did one other one previously, but basically this is a series of videos where I just explore different ideas and questions in a more free-form manner, as opposed to an essay-style video where I'm trying to make a specific point and then trying to support that point. There's some of that happening here, but more than anything I just want to, kind of free-form think about something and talk about it, kind of thinking out loud, going off of a few notes that I have. And so that's what we're doing here today. And the big question we're going to be taking a look at is whether or not media criticism can be objective. And by extension, can media's quality be objectively assessed? Does media have objective quality, and can that quality be uncovered? So before we get to that discussion, just a brief note on the presentation of this video and other Brainstorm videos. An idea that I've been sort of interested by for a while now is transparency in the work. Not only just trying to give a sense of sort of visual depth to some of the work that I make here, but also just, being really honest about how it's made and why it comes about. So if you're not into some of the crazy presentation, that's cool. That's fine. This is just something fun I get to do, and it exercises my brain a bit more. I get to be a bit more creative with this format. I can basically do whatever I want. Hopefully adding to that transparency, I've got a different setting on the microphone so you can hear more of the room. The toaster oven's going in the background, so you're probably going to be hearing some clicking. It's about 3:30 p.m. on November 14th. There's a dog barking outside. It's very upset about seeing another dog. The cat is trying to fall asleep, and it's been pretty warm. It's been like high 80s and even into the 90s here in LA, even halfway through November. So that's kind of interesting. It's almost a nice change of pace. It's a little bit cozy to have this temperature going right now. But you know what? Let's go ahead and get started. Hope you're cozy. Hope you're nice and relaxed. Try to follow along. I'll do my best to give this a structure that kind of makes sense. But since it is free form, there's going to be some jumps. But this is my third time trying to record this, so hopefully I've worked out a structure that follows somewhat logically and really gets to the meat of what I want to talk about here. Need a sip of water first. Got to keep the mouth from getting dry. That's a trick. If you ever hear on anybody's audio anywhere, if you hear like mouth sounds and clicks and stuff, it's almost definitely because they're just a little bit dehydrated. So you just have to drink water and liquids. You just have to drink stuff constantly to try to keep it minimized. So that's the big question. Can media criticism actually be objective? And we're going to get to some specific aspects of online reviews, but I'm sure this is something you've seen before. People will try really hard to convince you as a viewer that their take is objective. It's the truth, that they're not putting any personal preference into the equation. It's just the way it is. You'll see titles like honest review or like brutally honest review of X. And I'm not going to say right off the bat whether that's like a good or bad thing at all, but it does help to raise an interesting question. Can media criticism be objective in any realistic sense? And these other big reasons why I'm asking this question is because, well, for one thing, I do reviews on the channel. I do impressions videos, I do reviews, I do retrospectives of a sort, and even in videos in the past, I have claimed outright there's no such thing as objective media criticism. Everything I say, everything that other reviewers say is tinged by some kind of subjectivity. But then more recently, I've kind of been questioning that perspective because I've found that my stance on that changes quite a bit depending on which medium we're talking about. So for example, if we're talking about video games, I'm almost always tempted to just say, no, there's no objective criticism here. Everybody is so involved and immersed in a game that they're always bringing their own stuff to the table. So when someone comments on that game, it's quality, enjoyability, all that kind of stuff, there just has to be, they can't step outside of themselves, therefore it's not objective. But then on the other hand, if we're talking about like movies, and I think this is because I know a little bit more about filmmaking than game design, because I know next to nothing about game design, really. But if someone asks me, hey, is this movie like, objectively good or bad? Can we say that this movie is objectively good or bad? I would probably say yes, especially when it comes to really revered and respected, usually called art house movies, stuff like that. I would probably have a pretty good defense to be able to say this is objectively good. There's objective value here, especially if the movie has retained value over multiple decades. It just bolsters the argument. So which is it? Like, which, even just for me, what's my actual take on the subject? Can media criticism across the board, not just relevant to one medium or the other, can it be completely objective? Is it possible for particular people, maybe, to generate and communicate an objective assessment of something's total quality? So that's why I'm asking this. That's the big motivator for me. Hopefully to other people it's just kind of an interesting subject. Maybe some other people out there also review media in some way. Or, as I mentioned earlier, these videos are not formal at all. They're not like super academic, and so I don't do a lot of formal research. But my first instinct when I wondered whether there was a way I could research this whole topic, I just went ahead and watched a bunch of online reviews. I've talked about this one before, but I spend tons of time watching YouTube, not always actively. It's mostly just my background thing while I'm doing just about anything else. If I'm awake, it's on. It's gotten to that point. And in this case, I think that actually helped a lot to give me a better perspective on how reviews function today, how they're created, and how some of the people creating those reviews see themselves and see the work in relation to some kind of objectivity. First up, in watching just tons of reviews, and obviously I've seen hundreds, maybe even thousands of them in the past, of movies and games and shows and just about anything. So specifically in terms of the distinction of different elements within reviews, there is a major division between discussion about like craft, technical aspects on one side. These are two like categories, so we're going to be bringing these things with us. So over here in one basket is like craft, technical aspects of a work. And then on the other side, in a different basket, we have personal preference, like emotional impact of the work, sort of the experience of engaging with the work in some way. Yeah, like these are two very clear and distinct elements that will sometimes, or a lot of the time, come up in the same reviews. But then I also noticed that there are some reviewers who will try to focus entirely on one side or the other. Well, specifically in terms of reviews, I think it's much more common to find people who try to focus exclusively on the technical stuff. You know, we have like, especially for video games, we have stuff like Digital Foundry where they're not reviewing games per se, but they're looking at the technical aspects, how everything runs. But you also have people who they'll talk about a film exclusively through the lens of its craft, of cinematography, sound design and mixing, performances. And in contrast to that, there are also definitely plenty of channels that will look at media exclusively through the lens of the more emotionally or subjectively tinged areas, stuff like emotional impact, overall tone and effect, that sort of stuff. I feel like that tends to be much more common, not in reviews specifically, but rather like retrospectives, you know, or just people telling a story of how a particular piece of art has made them feel and what it means to them on a personal level. And then there's definitely a massive middle ground. I would argue that most media reviews you'll find specifically on YouTube combine the two elements. They will talk about specific technical aspects of the work, and they will also consider how it made them feel, what their impressions were, the more abstract elements of them engaging with it. This kind of brings up a much larger topic that I think is incredibly interesting, and which I can really only touch on here, but it's the topic of cultural perspectives on emotion versus rationality, and they're often dichotomized that way. They're often set against each other as like two extremes. I mean, it's very easy to see this stuff in practice, to get a sense of how our own culture, wherever you happen to live, it's easy to examine how emotion or rationality are weaponized in either like positive or negative ways. So for example, labeling a person or an argument or an entire group of people as being more rational or less rational, or more emotional or less emotional, it's a really common method for either validating or invalidating who those people are, what they stand for, what kind of arguments they're trying to make. And it happens in all kinds of spheres. It could happen at the workplace. It definitely happens in politics constantly. And yeah, even just interactions with friends, like, you're yelling at someone on the road, you got some kind of road rage or something. You can easily apply these tactics, even if only in a subconscious way. Let's say someone's freaking out at work, someone's trying to put them down and say, no, their perspective is just bad. They could easily say something like, oh, you're just being too emotional right now, therefore you're not making sense. You hear that kind of thing in old movies all the time. Or it could be the opposite side, where in certain situations it's seen as being a benefit to be slightly more emotional, quote unquote, or like emotionally involved. So like you could tell someone, oh, you're not considering the human side of this, you're too much of a robot, that's not helpful. And if you're interested in this subject in a much more in-depth and sort of dense academic way, I highly recommend an anthropological book called Unnatural Emotions from Catherine Lutz. It's really fantastic. It's dense, like I said. It's hard to get through, especially if you're not familiar or comfortable with like academic writing. But I think it does an excellent job of making the reader aware of how these dominant cultural perspectives actually manifest just in everyday life and in the public sphere, all that kind of stuff. But specifically, as this topic applies here, I see just a ton of online reviewers that try to downplay subjective takes and opinions. They even make false claims that all of the criticisms, all the negatives that they're presenting are purely objective when they might not be. In fact, they might do that with the positives. If they're really gushing about something and they don't want to accept that it has any flaws whatsoever, they could try to say, no, this is all just objective. I'm sure that everyone else would agree with me on these positive points, even if it's not really true. And in that way, it kind of functions as like a rhetorical device of trying to convince someone. So now that we've talked about those two major components of media criticism and reviews, especially online, and since we've also touched on that sort of conflict or exchange between emotion and rationality, so-called, I want to try to bring those two together, those two big topics together, by talking about how those two major elements of media criticism, with relation to the emotion rationality thing, or as we might rephrase those, subjectivity versus objectivity. Emotional stuff would typically be considered more subjective, and rational stuff would be typically considered more objective. I already said that the two big components of media criticism that I see are craft, technical stuff, and then on the other side, overall tone, effect, emotional impact, experiencing the work. If we're trying to answer that big question of whether media criticism can be objective, we need to find out whether these two different sets of components, these two different components of media criticism, can be discussed objectively. With the second component about like emotional impact, tone, effect, all that stuff, the gestalt of the work, the answer is a very easy no, right? Like, how on earth could you talk about those things in a purely objective sense? There's just no way. As I see it, there's just no way that you could talk about all those things with pure objectivity. Even setting aside the likely impossibility that anyone could ever say anything really objective and step outside of their own brain and their own experiences and personality and perspective, I just don't think you could. I don't think you would be doing a good job if you didn't look at those elements by engaging with them through your own perspective. And in fact, I think this is something that people have really come to appreciate about critics, reviewers, content creators, whatever you want to call them, people who are telling other people what they think about a work. So much of what we like a lot of the time, or hate, depending on the case, is that they have their own take, that they have their own opinion, they're bringing their own perspective to the table. Maybe you relate to their perspective in a certain way and you feel validated by their opinions, or maybe you appreciate that they have a very different perspective than yours, because of course all of us are constantly being influenced by past experiences, preferences, upbringing, all that kind of stuff. What we've been told is good and bad, how we respond to those kinds of messages. And in the present, we're also being affected by like cognitive biases, just our general mood, and what we've been doing lately, all this kind of stuff. In particular, I think recency bias plays a pretty huge role in media criticism online, especially since some of these like factory sites review stuff constantly, and they have to get everything done as quickly as possible to try to get as many clicks as possible. That's the whole thing. SEO is another topic I've talked about before. of work. But anyway, okay, so that's the one big component of media criticism is tone, effect, emotional involvement, impact. That has to be subjective. Discussion about those elements has to be subjective. So that doesn't help us out. But what about the other side? Can discussion about craft be objective? Can we objectively say that specific technical aspects of a work are good or bad or whatever? Can we assign them an objective quality? For me, the answer to this is only sort of. We can only sort of comment on these things in an objective sense. When we're talking about craft, when we're talking about technical aspects of a work, we are basically always referring to agreed upon rules or guidelines or standards relevant to each medium, because those standards are established. I don't care whether we're talking about game design, filmmaking, even visual arts. Like, there are standards that say this is how you do the thing well, this is how you execute this well. It all has to do with craft. And I think a good example of this in action is something like film editing, right? So film editing, there are tons of rules. There are tons of rules about film editing and what makes it good or bad, successful or not successful. These standards are basically held and agreed upon by the majority of people in the know. If you go to a film festival, a big fancy film festival like Cannes or TIFF or whatever, most people there, especially professional editors, know those rules, probably agree that they're good and bad ways to approach certain things. And so as a result, we can reference those rules and we can say, oh wow, this editing is not successful, this gets in the way, it's distracting from the tone or something else, or it's just plain making the story difficult to follow. So we can say that, and I would agree probably with a somewhat objective statement of whether editing is good or bad. But even if we accept the fact that all these standards and rules exist for specific technical aspects of work, those standards, they could change. They could absolutely change, especially over longer stretches of time. So as a result, we can only really definitively say that, for example, film editing is good or bad right now, in the current moment, based on what all those rules and dominant opinions on the quality of editing happen to be right now. And that's not especially useful. Is it really an objective statement about something if it's only true or objective temporarily? And at the same time, we need to leave room for experimentation, even in the present moment. Experimental techniques that you apply to craft often divide critique, I think, especially in media that's getting a bunch of attention and a lot of critics are looking at. Some people might say, hey, look, that was actually a positive choice that they chose to experiment with a specific element. Other people would say, no, it doesn't adhere to the rules and it didn't do anything new that was especially interesting or valuable in their estimation. So personally, I am doubtful that even with regards to craft, we could ever objectively say that one element or the other of a piece of media is good or bad. But you know what? Just to make the conversation a little bit more interesting, I think we should just say that critique of craft is always 100% objective, at least when coming from people who really understand craft and the relevant standards. Just because then we can say, okay, this one big component of media criticism is subjective and this other big component is objective most of the time. But when we bring that all together to try to answer the big question of whether media criticism can be objective, we've got a problem, don't we? Because when we consider reviews in their entirety, it doesn't work out at all. If a piece of media criticism were to only contain one of these components or the other, I would not consider it to be comprehensive. It would just be a piece of the puzzle as opposed to the whole picture. So for example, sure, you want to talk about the game design and difficulty progression of, I don't know, a game like Metroid Dread. It's just some random game. Sure, you could do that, and you could do it with a relative sense of objectivity, I suppose. I'll go ahead and give you that. I'll say, sure, it's objective enough, but I wouldn't call that a full review. No, I would call that like an examination, analysis of the craft behind the game, as opposed to a look at the game in its entirety. I really do think you need both of these components in media criticism, and therefore there's always going to be at least one big subjective component to any review or comprehensive piece of media criticism. So that brings us to our final answer, or rather my answer that I've come up with and that I think is right, which is on this page, it's technically possible to provide somewhat objective commentary about specific aspects of a piece of media, even though that objectivity itself isn't really objective, but instead based on subjective perspectives that happen to be bolstered by perceptions of authority. But it's not possible to deliver an objective, comprehensive review of media, because the review wouldn't be complete without also commenting on the more abstract and emotionally active totality of the work. So I'm still fine in terms of kind of applying this to my own reviews and other people's reviews and what I think of them. It's still totally fine to have supposedly objective statements about the quality of specific aspects of the work, but much broader statements about quality are always going to be subjective. They just are. And those subjective statements about quality are still valid. Of course they're still valid. And it's why I will continue to do reviews if I think that I can offer something kind of unique or my own perspective on it. That's why I do it, is because of that sense of subjectivity. But these are never going to be ironclad statements or like reviews or takes on a specific work, unless the person watching them happens to agree with the take. And I think that's just about everything. I hope that made sense to someone other than me. I've struggled to make this structure work in any real way. But I am pretty satisfied to come to this conclusion of, well, it's complicated. I don't think actual criticism can actually ever be purely objective. If I come across someone claiming that their review is completely objective, I am immediately going to be very skeptical, and I'm going to wonder why they think it's so important to act like the review is objective. It could be like a branding thing, that they want to appear like a truth sayer or something like that, or maybe they honestly believe it and believe that they are somehow able to step outside of themselves to talk about the quality of a piece of work. I really don't think it's a thing. And so I guess in a way I'm returning to the statement I've made in other videos of any review I make, there's always a subjective element to it. I'm not the be-all, end-all. Even if I do have some kind of expertise in a particular topic, there's not many, but there's a couple. It's not the final word. I can never tell you exactly how you're going to feel about something, and I'm never going to tell you how you should feel about something. I'm rarely trying to convince people that a show or a movie or a game has a certain amount of quality or the absence of. But I think that's about it. I gotta stop now. Okay, so this is sort of an extra segment that I'm recording much later than the original audio for this piece. But basically, after finishing this whole thing, and I kind of discussed this in the preamble, but like the Brainstorm videos, they're not structured at all, really. I'm just going off on notes, and I'm often coming up with stuff while I'm talking. And certainly after the fact, after I got the audio edited, I realized that depending on who you are, some of the stuff I'm talking about here might sound a little complicated, and for other people it might seem incredibly basic, because one of the biggest conclusions I arrived at through this discussion was just that I don't think any media criticism can be purely objective and just identifying specific aspects of reviews and critique that are subjective and objective. To plenty of people that might seem very obvious, especially for people who do this kind of work, or like I often hear some really good professional YouTubers who I respect a whole lot talk about identifying those different factors and saying, okay, now I'm speaking to something that's a little bit more objective. Now I'm speaking to something that's a little bit more subjective. But regardless of how obvious some of this stuff might seem, for one thing, I still really wanted to make my stance on this stuff, my current stance on this stuff, very clear so that it could hopefully provide some additional context for people who want to watch my other videos, especially reviews or media criticism work. And beyond that, there are plenty of lessons or concepts that are obvious but that we still forget about in the heat of the moment. Do you know what I mean? Like, there are things that you teach kids that sound so obvious when you say them to an adult, but they're not always things that we actually live by, like just treating people well and respecting everybody or whatever it happens to be. It sounds so simple in concept, and if you confront someone with that idea, they'll be like, of course I do that. But in reality, it's tough. We have to really work to sort of engage ourselves in doing the good thing, even if it's like a really basic tenet of morality that pretty much everybody alive 5 agrees on. In this case, especially when it comes to YouTube media criticism, especially when it comes to comments underneath YouTube media criticism and reviews and such, I think it's very important for all of us, definitely myself included, to remember that, none of this stuff is actually objective. Even if we're talking about the so-called objective aspects of a work, there's always room for different interpretations and different means of experiencing those aspects. Sort of my personal example of going through some of this stuff somewhat recently is, the Metroid video. Basically, chances are if you're watching this video, you were not introduced to my channel through the Metroid video, because that one got a very, very negative response. I've done a couple of other videos in the past that had some kind of, I don't want to say controversy, because none of my stuff is that big, so I don't know if it can really qualify as controversy, but there are definitely things that I've said and things that I've released where plenty of people responded very negatively to it, and some of those people tried to express why they were responding negatively. But in particular, the Metroid video has a pretty decent number of views, and in fact, I've even been considering publishing the dislike number in the thumbnail so that everybody can see, because I very much disagree with YouTube's decision to stop displaying dislike numbers. That's another topic. Anyway, there were certain responses to that video and certain responses to the David Jaffe Metroid videos that I was referencing in my own video that I felt just sort of abandoned this idea that really did try to either claim that other people were making objective statements about the quality of a game or the enjoyability of a game, or they themselves were trying to make objective statements about the game. Certainly from my opinion, as I've established in this video, I don't think any of it's subjective at all, and therefore I don't see that as being like a really good basis for an argument, or specifically I don't think it's a good basis for attacking someone else's position on a topic. I don't want to call anybody out and whatever. It's of course it's fine for people to disagree with me. I actually enjoy it, and I enjoy talking about this stuff most of the time. But specifically, in response to some of Jaffe's comments, I saw people attacking, for one thing, people were attacking him so viciously that, for one thing, too much, time to dial it back. He's a human being. We're all human beings. It's okay if he doesn't like the game you like. It's A-okay. I know we get emotional and we get built up on this stuff, but it's all right. But beyond that, there were people who were trying to present themselves as being like really rational and objective, right? Because part of the objective appeal, right? Part of the purpose of presenting yourself as being very objective is trying to seem unemotional and detached, right? Like, I'm just speaking the truth. And there were people saying things like, Jaffe knew that he was lying about the game. He knew that he wasn't right, and he was just doing this all out of like spite or wanting to be really negative or something. And those kind of comments in particular really kind of pushed me over the edge into trying to make this video and just trying to say something of some relative value, I guess, about this concept and our relationship with and our perception of subjectivity and objectivity in media criticism, because it's important. It is honestly important, and especially when we're getting into these big arguments online about media, none of which are really all that important in the end, in sort of the broader scope of world events. I don't think that the idea that someone's like going out of their way to, I don't know, have like an interpretation of a work that you don't agree with just to make people mad, I guess it's a possibility. I guess there could be some kind of edgelords out there who really do make an effort to kind of troll people via their opinions on media, but it has to be pretty darn rare. And certainly in terms of Jaffe's case and plenty of other reviewers talking about a lot of different games that they didn't like, I don't really get the sense that anyone's trying to tell other people not to like it. They're basically always just sharing their own opinions. That's certainly all that I'm ever trying to do. I've touched on this idea before in some other videos, but honestly, I've just as a person talking into a microphone under a blanket, because I don't have any soundproofing here, it's just my thoughts. Plenty of people say that on YouTube, but like it's just my thoughts. They're really not that important. If it sparks like really healthy discussion, That's really cool. If people relate with my feelings and it informs their decisions about a work or like inspires them to check it out or something for themselves and they discover something they really like, that's also great. People really disagree with me and in that way my comments inspire them to engage with the work. That's also cool. But anyway, I just wanted to add this addendum to reinforce my conviction in making this video at all. So even if some of it does sound kind of basic and kind of like obvious, especially to those who have studied media criticism in some capacity, it's for my own peace of mind and it's so that I can communicate more clearly with my audience. But that's about it. Thank you so much. This is yet another very long brainstorm video, but I think I'm done now and I'm ready to move on to the next thing. And that's about it. You're wonderful, probably. I don't know. Are you? Let me know in the comments if you're a good person. That's not. Nope, we're not doing that. Thanks for stopping by.